Welcome to the last part of the flower tutorial. Today we're gonna finish this off, right? We got the petals, we got the little stringy parts, we got the stem, but we still need the materials for those parts, right? We need the materials for the stem, for the little stringies as well, but we also need some leaves, right? A flower usually comes with leaves, so we need to get that in here as well. So let's start off with that, right? So to get the little leaves, I'm gonna start off by adding a plane, so Shift A, mesh and plane, and the reason why is because for the leaves we're gonna use a texture, right? We're not gonna make the leaves textures ourselves. It's gonna be a little tricky, so we're gonna use a texture instead, and it's gonna be much faster than actually having to texture that ourselves. So let's go into render view right away, and if we want to use a texture for this, we need a texture first, right? So I'll provide that for you, right? I'll add a download link below and you can just download it. The way I got this was, well, actually with some help of AI, right? It's very useful to create textures. But you can also just photograph leaves in your area, right? You can just capture those and use whatever leaf you can find as a texture, right? Just remove the background with a tool of your choice and you'll be fine. And I'm just going to hit new to get a new shader. This may look a little bit different, this interface of Blender. That's because I'm using the newest version, right? You can get it from the website. So to get that fixed, right? So to add a texture, what do? Well, we can just select our principal BSDF and press Ctrl T, and that will add an image texture. Now, if that doesn't happen for you, it means you don't have Node Wrangler enabled. You can go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then just look for Node Wrangler, enable that, and you're fine, right? We've done this many times, right? So I'm gonna open a texture and I'm just gonna locate where I got that, and it's gonna be called flower leaf, right? There we go. This is the same file as that you're gonna download, so just locate that. And we have a color input, but we also want to use that alpha output, right? So we can just connect the alpha to the alpha, and right away the background will be gone. Beautiful. So this is the texture. It may look a little bit bright, possibly because there's a little light on top of that, right? So this is what it looks like. And to just make this look a bit better, what I'm going to do is crank up my roughness, right? I don't really want that much glossiness or anything coming from the lights. I just want them primarily the colors of that leaf. So I'm going to crank up the roughness to, well, almost 1, I guess. And sometimes when I create nature things and we have textures, I will crank up the specular, or not crank up, crank down the specular. I wanted to say crank open the specular tab, and we can just crank this down, right? And that means you'll get more of that color and less of that diffuse that is gonna be added by your lights and stuff like that, right? If I crank this all the way up, you can see more of that reflections and stuff from the world, I guess. And if we crank this down, you will see more of the color. And usually when I have a texture, there's a little bit of that scattering and stuff like that already happening within the leaf, which means that I sometimes just crank this down a little bit. Alright, so we get more of that original color back. But that's according to your own liking, of course. So this is not all we're gonna do. I wanna add a little bit of curvature in the leaf itself. So the way I'm gonna do that is to just go into edit mode, right? Press Tab, Ctrl R to add some edge loops. In this direction, let's add a few more, there we go. And in the other direction as well, and just scroll up if you want more edge loops, and then left click to apply. And you can just press escape to cancel that, so it will be perfectly aligned in the middle. Alright, so now we actually have some geometry that we can work with, and we can, for example, grab this little point there that is already quite aligned with the tip of the leaf. And we can set our proportional editing tool to enabled. You can press O or just click the little button there in the top. And I'm gonna set this to sharp. So with sharp selected and that point, we can just press G and Z and move that entire point down a little bit, right? So you can see that we're actually getting quite a sharp indent there. But I think that works quite well with the little middle part of the leaf as well, right? There's always a little bit of a nice indent there. So I think it works quite well having it like this. So let's press right mouse and shade this smooth, just, well, because it will be better. And let's actually select this edge there and press G and Z as well. Let's move that down slightly too. And you can always just rotate your entire leaf just a little bit if you'd like that, right? So if you set this to smooth instead, you can press R and Y and you can rotate it and it will just be slightly angled, which sometimes can add a little bit of a nice effect to your object, right? So this is looking quite nice. So what I'm going to do next is, if we want to use this as an instance on this little stem, we need the origin point to be set properly, right? So where do we want this object to spawn from? And that is at this little edge there, right? It would be nice if we can connect this to the stem. So what I'm going to do is hold shift, press right mouse, and it will make our 3D cursor appear at that point. Then we can press right mouse, set origin to 3D cursor. Amazing. So now if we rotate this, it's going to be rotating around that origin point as well. So this is not all I want for the leaf. I also want to use this input, right, this color leaf, as a little bit of a roughness, or let's say what is it called? The normal input, right? So press G, move that to the side a little bit. I'm going to drag out the color, and I'm going to set that as a color ramp. And that way we have a little bit of a, well, black and white mask that we can use for the bump value, the height value of our bump map. I'm going to drag this a bit to the right. Let's hit Shift A. And by the way, if you want to visualize a node, you can press Ctrl Shift and left click on it, and it will make it appear without shading. So we will just see the flat colors, which is quite nice. Hit Shift A and search for a bump and connect that there. Now we don't want the color into the normal, but we want it into the height, right? Because a black and white value will be a height value in this case. And now we can see what the bump map actually looks like, right? So we can control the black and white values, and it will control pretty much what we will see as a bump map, right? So I think we already get some nice contrast there. It looks quite alright to me. We can always just crank that down so we have just a little bit of that bump. So if you want to see how this looks, just Ctrl Shift click back on your principal BSDF, and there we go, right? Connect that up, of course, to the normal. And now you can see that if we add more strength, we're actually getting more of that little bit of a bump value. And if I just move this down to more of the lights, you can see that we're getting more of that bump values back as well. Now this is a little bit too strong for my liking, so probably something like this works better. So this is already something we can use quite well. Alright, so I'm also going to use this color ramp, so Ctrl Shift D that to duplicate it with the connections instead. We're going to connect that to the roughness actually, right? So we have a little bit of roughness variation. Now Ctrl Shift click that. I don't want this to be completely glossy. So a black value is completely glossy, white value is completely rough. And I don't want any part of this to be completely glossy. So I'm going to crank up that black value to something more gray. Something like that, right? So I want the entire thing to be quite rough. So we can set our values to be, well, the lightest as possible there, which is completely rough, so a roughness of 1. And the black value can be more of a light grayish color, right? So there's some variation, but not as much, right? So Ctrl Shift click back on the principal BSDF, and that looks quite alright. Okay, so if we want to make more changes to this, let's say we're not very satisfied with how the color looks, maybe we want some more color, we can hit Shift A and search for a hue and saturation value. And we can connect that there. Now we want more saturation, we can just crank that up. And perhaps we want the hue to be a little bit more greenish or like that. We can make that happen, right? And the value, you can actually make this darker as well. So let's say you have an overexposed image, you can crank the value down, or you can just use a bright contrast value there, right? So let's say we crank that afterwards. We can just crank down the brightness. Once you do that, you will realize that the contrast is also going to crank up at the same time a little bit, right? So you may have to just crank that down too, to get the nice look you want, right? I think for me it was quite alright at the start. Something like this looks fine. And what I'm actually going to do as well is drag this out, hit Shift A and search for an add shader. Reason why is because it sometimes looks really nice if there's some light shining through your leaves, and I don't want to add any subsurface scattering because that's going to slow down our entire Blender rendering stuff. So the shader that we're going to add is actually a translucent BSDF. Now it doesn't look right at this point, but we can connect the color outputs from our entire leaf setup here to the translucent color, and you'll see that we have the same look, right? But it's not exactly the same. So let's hit Shift A and find another hue saturation value, and we can now crank down that value all the way. A value of 0 is going to basically mean that we have no translucent shader whatsoever, but if I crank this up, you can see more and more that we're getting some light shining through that. Beautiful. And especially when we have a little light coming from behind, for example. Let's see. You can see that we're actually getting some light shining through that, right? So if I set this to 0, we don't have any, but as I crank this up more and more, we have some light coming from the back of that leaf, which can look really nice in your renders without having too much extra render time, right? So I'm going to set this value at 0.2, something like that. And that looks quite decent, right? So let's move this to the sides. We'll use this, but not in this location. And whenever I want to use something, but it doesn't have to be in a render view, or it's not going to be anywhere near the scene, I will just move it down like that. Now let's press F2 to rename that to leaf. There we go. So back in our actual flower, right? That's what we're working on. We can now go to the Geometry Node tab. Now, if you can't find your nodes, right? If you're moving around, you can find it. Just press home on your keyboard and it will bring you right through your nodes, right? Beautiful. So what we want to do is add those leaves at some point on this curve, right? So we can start off by looking at our curve, which is the group inputs, right? Remember, we have a little curve that we draw. That's our input. We want to use that to scatter around our actual petal, or sorry, leaves. So we can drag that out to the bottom, for example, and find an instance on points. There we go. Now we can set this instance to be an object info, and we can set that to be our leaf object. There we go. Right, so once this is a leaf object, it is going to get that object and instance that on any point that the curve has. So we can specify exactly where our leaves are going to be located at, right? So this instance, I want that to be attached to the join geometry as well, so we can actually see what's happening. So right now, we're getting some leaves that spawn along the curve on the points of our Bezier curve, as you can see, right? So that's not really what we want. We want to be able to tell where it spawns and where it doesn't, right? So what we can do is I only want to spawn my leaves at the end point, but not really at the end point, somewhere along this curve at the top there. So how do we actually give the information of where we want that to be? It's very easy actually. So all we need is to specify the selection of points that we want to keep first, right? So we only want that endpoint there to be kept. So drag that out and type endpoint selection, right? And that way we can actually define the start and the end size. So by default, this is 1 and 1, and we'll actually get a leaf at the start and the end point because that's the only point it's going to keep. The first point and the end point. So we only want the end point. So just drag that start size back to 0. And we will only have an endpoint there. Beautiful. So this is a little bit too high on the little stem for my liking. So I want this to be more down. So how do we take care of that? Quite easy. If you want this curve to be shorter, right? If you want this endpoint to be anywhere along the curve, but shorter away from the start point, that's one way to say it. We can hit Shift A and we can find a trim curve. Trim curve. There we go. And connect that, right? So now if I just swipe down at endpoints, you can see that our leaf is going to start moving around as well, right? So if I go back to solid view and I crank my endpoint to different lengths, you can see that's actually moving. Now we can define exactly at what point on the curve our leaf is going to spawn, right? Beautiful. So that is what the trim curve will take care of. Amazing. So let's clean this up just a little bit. There we go. Beautiful. All right, so what's next? If we go into render view, it looks quite nice, right? It is actually coming from the stem, but it's also, well, it is not perfect, right? So I want this to be angled based on the curve, right? So this has to rotate a little bit alongside the curve as well. So it goes more into this direction. And we can take care of that by setting the rotation of our instance, right? And it's very easy. All we need is to drag that rotation out and find an align Euler to vector node. And the align Euler to vector node is just going to take care of aligning our rotation to a specific vector direction, right? And the rotation in this case is going to be the rotation of our leaf, right? The initial rotation it has and with which it's pounced on the curve. Connect that up. And our second vector value is going to be something with information of that curve, right? And we've done it with the flower head as well, taking care of that rotation. So I won't go all the way into detail once again, but all we need is a curved tangent, right? So drag this out into a curved tangent, and right away you can see some things happening, right? Something's happening. It may not be the correct rotation, but we can just fix that by, well, aligning it to a different axis, for example, the Y or the Z. Right, and the Z actually looks fine, right? It actually aligns perfectly to that curve. Amazing. So that is one leaf that looks quite nice. And I actually want a second leaf, right? I just want a second leaf because 2 leaves is better than 1. So let's take care of that. So how do we do that? Well, quite easily, I'd say. We can just duplicate this setup, right? And then spawn another one. And what I'm going to do actually is I want the same instance, but rotate it in a different way around our actual stem. All right, so we don't have to duplicate this entire setup. All we need to do is duplicate this instance on point node. All right, so Ctrl-Shift-D that, and then we can join it back up here. So now we actually have 2 leaves. Beautiful. And we can just rotate one of them. So Shift-A and search for rotate instances. There we go. And we can just rotate this one with, for example, a value on the Z-axis. And the Z-axis is going to be aligned to our curve as well. So beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Something like that looks quite nice. So now we have one of those leaves rotated a little bit. Now I also want to rotate this a little bit down or up. Well, depends. So what we can do is just find the axis that takes care of that. So let's try Y first. There's a little bit of rotation. That's quite nice actually. So to make that a little bit more random for every flower we will draw, we can actually drag the rotation out to a combine X, Y, and Z. There we go. Now our Z value is going to be 0 again. So our leaves are going to be spawning inside of each other, but we can actually set the Z value to be half a circle rotation, which is going to be 180 degrees. And that is equal to pi. Right? Is that? Yeah. There we go. A full circle is 2 pi. A half a circle is pi. Right? So this is actually radians. This takes degrees. So we need to actually add radians here, which is why I use pi. So beautiful. Now for the X and Y value, I want this to be a little bit random. So let's drag that out to a random value. And by default, it's going to be set from 0 to 1. Now that's a little bit too strong for my liking. So I'm going to set this from minus 0.5 to perhaps 0.5. I think I'm going to set the max to be 0.2 and the minus to be minus 1. Right, and if you don't like the current one, just change the seed, right? It's going to be angled a little bit lower. Looks quite nice. And for the X, or the Y value, I'm going to do the same. So duplicate this, Shift D, connect that to the Y. Beautiful. So it's going to be rotating just a little bit. And this can be a bit stronger, perhaps minus 1 to 1. And we can change the seed there as well to see how that looks. All right, that's a little bit too strong. So minus 0.5 to 0.5, right? So that's going to be the value. Beautiful. Now I want the same for the second one, right? The exact same rotation value. So what we can do is just group this, hit Shift, and we can just group this rotate instances with the rotation values. Press Ctrl G. Now this is going to be our group, and there's a few values that we want to be able to control. First of all, let's see. We don't really need to change this two values too much. We've already tried it with the left leaf, which is fine. And what I do want is a little bit of control over that Z value, because if we're just gonna group this and use this for the other leaf as well, then it's gonna rotate in the same direction and we have two leaves in exactly the same place again. So we want to control the Z value there. Beautiful. And we can even call that, for example, Z rotation. Beautiful. Now if we exit this group, we can see that we have a nice clean node setup. So let's name this rotate instances randomly. There we go. So now we can use that for the top instances as well. Now you can see what I talked about is going to be set at the same rotation. And that's why we set the Z rotation back to 0. Beautiful. Right, so the only issue we have now is that if we draw more of these curves, the leaves are going to be rotated exactly the same every single time pretty much. And that is the last thing we pretty much have to fix there. And it's easy. If we go into edit mode of that group, there's just one thing that we need to change, right? So for every group, it's now going to have the same random value pretty much. And I just want to change that seed randomly as well. So drag that out to a random value. And now we have a random value connected to a random value. Beautiful. So the maximum can be whatever. I'm going to set this to 1,000,000 perhaps, something like that. Right, so now if we draw a new stem there, you can see the rotation is going to be different for every single leaf that we draw, pretty much. Every single strand that we draw will have a slightly different rotation of those flowers, which is nice, right? So beautiful. I'm going to Ctrl Z until we have our original flower. Beautiful. And there we go. That is how we control the rotation. Beautiful. All right, so for the scale of those instances, I want that to be random as well, a little bit. So crank that out to a random value too. And I don't want this to be a vector, but I want this to be a float. And that way our scale is going to be uniform, all right? Because we only have one value. And I want this from minus the minimum value to be like 0.4 and the maximum to be perhaps 2, right? Or that's too much, 1.4. There we go, quite some big leaves, right? So now one is going to be smaller than the other. Amazing. So we're going to add a random seed there as well, random value, just for security, pretty much. Amazing. And yeah, just change the seed according to what you like, right? So that is amazing, and we can do the same thing for the other instance right there. Beautiful. Random scale. I'm going to set this from 1 to 1.6 perhaps now. Yeah, there we go. And for the end point of our trim curve, I think maybe 0.87. A bit higher. There we go. Beautiful. All right, so now we have some leaves that are actually connecting to our flower quite beautifully. All right, so now we just need a material for the stem, which is going to be a very easy part because it's a stem, right? What can you do? So let's go to the material section, hit plus, and let's name this new material. Let's name this stem. There we go. Now in the geometry nodes, we need to define what that material is going to be applied to, which is going to be the curve to mesh, right? This takes care of creating the stem. So Shift A, set material there, and material is going to be the stem, of course. Now for the material, let's just make a little brown color first, something like that. We want that to be quite basic flower colored, right? So it's basically a little bit brown usually, I think, something like that. For the roughness, I'm going to crank this a little bit up. But I want a little bit of a noise texture at least, right? So hit Shift A and find a noise texture. And let's connect the color to the base color as well. And hit Ctrl T with the noise texture selected. So that way we get a mapping node. And usually when you don't want to take care of UVing, which in this case isn't really necessary, we could just connect the object to the vector. And usually we get quite a nice layout there. All right, so I'm going to crank up the scale of this noise value. And the detail perhaps, let's see, Shift A, find a color ramp, connect that up, and Ctrl Shift click on that so we can see what it looks like, and crank your values a bit closer. There we go. So now we can see what that noise texture actually looks like a bit more, and the size as well. Something like this. I want it to be quite rough. I feel like it gives a little bit more detail in our flower. Maybe even crank down the scale and crank up that roughness and detail a little bit more. Like that. And I'm gonna just make this a bit more smooth altogether, like that perhaps. All right, and maybe we need more scale, something like this. Let's just see how that looks, right? So Ctrl Shift click on the Principled BSDF. Now obviously we don't want a black and a white color there, but before we add color, I also want to connect this to, for example, the roughness, right? You just have a little bit of a roughness variation. And I don't want that to be completely black for the roughness. So to change that, so to not have the black value all the way up, we can add another color ramp, Shift A color ramp, just before the roughness value. And we can just change the black to be a little bit lighter, right? So we don't have a completely glossy part there, but it's going to be nice and rough. Same thing we did for the leaves. Beautiful. For the color, Shift A, add another color ramp. And now we can set this to be the color that we actually want, right? So I want some kind of a color for a flower, more like the brown greenish. And the white part, we can just make it a bit lighter, I guess. Maybe something like that. So we have a little bit of variation, but it's quite subtle. Wow. So let's play around with this a little bit more. I want to use the same color ramp for the bump map, the normal map. So drag this out to a color ramp, right? In case we need to change that, and crank this out to a bump. And now we can actually select the height input right away and just connect that to the normal map, right? So let's see how that looks. That's way too strong. So let's crank down the strength just a little bit. So we have a little bit of that bump, but not too much, right? And I don't want this to be black, for example. Let's just crank this a bit more to the white values as well. And then we can crank, well, let's play around with that a little bit. I want to see it just a little bit. We get a little bit of a hint of roughness there. Amazing. So that is already looking quite decent, I would say. So we may have to mesh this a little bit more with the color of this little stringy part there, the stem of the leaf, just because it has to look like the same material pretty much. So let's go in here and maybe just make this a bit more colorful, a bit more bright. Something like that perhaps. Let's see. That looks a little bit better already. And for the brown parts, I'm just gonna crank the lightness up a little bit, make it a bit more green too. I think that looks quite decent, right? Maybe that's a bit too much. Something like that, right? And for the stem, we can actually also try to find an add shader node. Shift A, add shader. And let's add another translucent BSDF, right? Let's just try and connect the color there. So we have a little bit of shining through there, but it's too much. So hit Shift A and find our hue saturation value. And let's crank the value down to almost 0, maybe 0.2 as well. Right? Just so that there's going to be a little bit of light shining through. Amazing. So the last thing we want to texture is those little stringy parts, right? And that's going to be quite easy. So the stringy parts are going to be, this is the entire flower head. So we need to go into the flower head, edit, group, and we need to find the part that actually add those strings, which is the upper part that we created right there, right? So Shift A, set material, and this is going to be a new material. So hit the plus sign and name this to be pollen, probably pollen. There we go, select that there as well. And now in the shader editor, we can just make this like a little bit of a yellow material, right? Something like this. I'm not going to spend time on that material at all because it is going to be, well, very thin and you will barely recognize it if you are at normal distances from the flower, right? Something like that. So this is looking quite nice already. I think the stem's a little thick though. So in the geometry nodes, for that stem, we can just crank down the radius of our original curve circle to maybe 0.16, maybe 0.18. There we go. Beautiful. So now we actually have a flower, right? So now we can draw more flowers and it should all work procedurally completely, right? Amazing. So last thing I want to do is I want the leaves to be bigger according to how long our flower is, right? A longer flower needs to have a thicker stem, but also needs to have, for example, bigger leaves, right? So that's the last thing I'm just going to try and do. So first things first, the curve radius, set curve radius. We want that to be a little bit dependent on our length of the spline, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's hit Shift A and find a math node. And we don't want this to be add, but to multiply. I want to multiply this with the length of the spline, right? So let's drag this out to a spline length. All right, so you may recognize or see that there is a length value in the spline parameter, but also a length in the spline length node. So what's the difference? Well, in easy terms, the spline parameter length is the length combined of every curve in your, in your object, right? So if I have two curves, then our length is going to be dependent on the length of both of those curves together, while the spline length actually gets the curve from each individual spline, which means that each drawn flower will have its own little thickness, right? Beautiful. So this is too thick though. So hit Shift A and find another math node, and let's just multiply this with a little bit of a smaller value, 0.1 perhaps. That's too much. 0.2. Yeah, 0.2 looks fine, right? So now if our flower is longer, it's actually getting a thicker stem, right? So maybe it's a bit too much. 0.17. There we go, that looks great. And for the leaves, I want to do something similar, right? A little bit similar to this. So we need to get the scaling there, right? And I want that to happen for both of these scale values. So what I can do is hold shift and right mouse and drag this across there. So we have one little string that we can control. And we want to add shift a math node in between there and set that to multiply. And we want to multiply that with a similar value of this, right? So I'll spline length, duplicate that, and connect that to the multiply value, right? So that's going to be very big. So shift A, find a math node, and set that to multiply, right? And then just find a value that works for you. 0.2 perhaps. A little bit too much still, 0.15 maybe. Right, so now our leaves are, maybe that's too much still, 0.12. Something like that. Our leaves are actually going to be scaled according to how long our spline is, right? So if I go to edit mode and draw a bigger flower, that's a weird flower, you can see that we have a very nice scaling leaves, but our flower head doesn't scale yet, right? So that's the last thing we need to do. And our flower head is added right here with the scale. And we can use the same setup. Spline length, there we go. Shift A, math node, set to multiply, connect the length, and connect the multiply value to the scale. Right, it's too big once again, so 0.2 for example, 0.15, let's see, 0.1. I think 0.1 looks, maybe 0.13. 0.12. 0.12 is the value we go with, right? So if I delete everything now, delete all my curves and I draw a new one, it's going to be scaled in the length of the curve values, right? There we go. Looks quite decent. Let's see a smaller one. That looks nice as well. And now let's draw a very big one. There we go. That looks great as well, right? So no matter how big you draw your flower now, it is completely procedural, which is very, very nice. Right, so that is pretty much it. We now have a procedural flower, right? Amazing. Now you can draw this up or down or whatever way you like this to be drawn. Everything should work quite nice. And what I like to do when you have your final flower is to just select one of those points and rotate this with your proportional editing tool, right? Just rotate everything around the Z-axis, for example. And that way it's gonna be a little bit more interesting to look at. Right, let's rotate this more, something like that perhaps, right? Our strand is now looking a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more natural perhaps as well, but it looks nice, right? So it's very procedural and it looks very beautiful, right? So I hope that helped. Obviously I'm not gonna go into the full render of this, but I think you already can tell that the flower is now finished. Beautiful, right? Let's draw just a few more there, create a nice little setup of flowers. Amazing. Beautiful. You can draw an entire garden if you want, right? So just more, draw them in whatever shape you want them to be drawn in, right? It works very procedurally. All right, amazing. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Last part was a little bit longer, but there was a little bit more information that I wanted to give you to make this fully procedural, right? With the length as well. And yeah. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, subscribe. I will enjoy any one of those. And then I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day and cheers.